It was one of the biggest breakups in rock and roll history. I mean, after creating a catalog of desert island albums, this immortal band was torn apart by bitter feuding, behind-the-scenes schemes, and as one band member described it, borderline megalomania. Sadly, the inability of its two principal members to put their differences aside really has cost the world dearly. We can at least be grateful, though, for what did survive. Today, it's the downfall and resurrection of one of rock's preeminent bands and the story of how they took flight after leaving their self-proclaimed leader, standing alone on the runway with a record that lit up radio. It's coming up next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you've ever stood in line for 30, 40 minutes to buy an overpriced band shirt at your favorite band's concert, enjoying every second of it, mind you, you're going to dig this channel. Mega nostalgia all the time. Make sure to subscribe below right now. We also have a Patreon you're going to want to check out, though you'll find even more content. It helps us to keep the music alive and to keep this channel going. Today, we're taking a deep dive into one of Pink Floyd's most interesting periods. You know, when Roger Waters and David Gilmour's musical partnership was dissolved and the first post-Waters album was created. The 1987 record, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, really focusing on his first single, Learning to Fly. It went to #1 on the rock charts and started a new chapter in the band's legacy, but leading up to that point, very interesting. You know, at some point in the 1970s, Roger Waters decided that he alone was Pink Floyd. And after being the driving conceptual force behind monumental albums like Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and of course The Wall, all in all, it's just another brick in the wall. This was the conclusion that he came to. Roger Waters was a brilliant lyricist and a brilliant storyteller, but for all Pink Floyd's success, it was never all Waters. David Gilmour was a prodigious talent on guitar and beyond. And of course, drummer Nick Mason and keyboardist Rick Wright brought so much to the music beyond Waters. Roger Waters, however, was convinced that he was the only idea man. And after the big bust-up of 1979, when Waters fired Wright from the band, things got a lot tougher, especially between David Gilmour and Roger Waters. Roger began consolidating power during the creation of 1983's The Final Cut. The album consisted entirely of Roger's writing, and apart from his guitar solos, David's input was really minimized. According to Nick Mason, Roger was studiously ignoring all of David's suggestions. Waters also took on the bulk of the vocal duties himself, leaving David Gilmour to sing only one song on the record, Not Now, John. Which really a huge waste of talent. I mean, I love Roger and David's voices, both of them. But to have Gilmour so underrepresented, just wrong. Said Mason, it may well have been paranoia, but it did look as though David was being frozen out. With no writing contribution at all from David, his role was inevitably eroded, and what ensued was a massive argument about credits. Eventually, David's name disappeared altogether, although it was agreed that he would still be paid. But Mason, he had his own problems. Before he even started work on The Final Cut, Roger announced rather aggressively that since Mason was only drumming, he couldn't claim extra royalties or credit for that record. Nick described Roger's behavior as bordering on megalomania. Ultimately, the drummer would invest extensive time creating and recording sound effects for the album, but he would receive no compensation for the efforts. By the time The Final Cut was finished, Roger Waters was effectively running the show. Intentional or not, the name of the album symbolized exactly what Waters was doing to the rest of the band. He was making The Final Cut. From then on, the three remaining members of Pink Floyd all agreed on just one thing, that they would not work together any longer. Said Mason, it would have been hard to imagine a show that would follow The Wall anyway. But that was another factor in how David and I viewed the future. Both David and myself regarded playing live and touring as an integral part of being in the band. Being part of a Roger-led Floyd meant that there would be no live shows and only aggravation in the recording studio. The future prospects seemed distinctly unappealing. So, the three bandmates, they focused on solo projects instead. Gilmour released About Face, that was in March of 1984. Bob Ezrin producing that one.
Love on the air, I keep transmitting with reception.
Waters revived The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. It's a project he had proposed as an alternative to The Wall. And that was released in April of '84. And then Nick Mason released Profiles in July of 1985 with 10cc guitarist Rick Fenn and David Gilmour making a vocal appearance on Life for Life. However, none of these albums came close to the success of their former band. And during this period, Waters also attempted to renegotiate his contract with manager Steve O'Rourke in secret. However, Steve felt morally obliged to tell the rest of the band that Roger was dealing behind their backs. Waters saw this as a betrayal, and of course, Waters and O'Rourke parted ways. That happened in June of '85. Now, in December of 1985, Roger Waters announced his intentions to leave Pink Floyd in a letter to EMI and CBS. In it, he asked to be released from his contract, but that wasn't enough. He also sought to prevent Gilmour and Mason from recording under the banner of Pink Floyd. According to Mason, Waters wholeheartedly believed that he was Pink Floyd. In his view, he had carried the band on his shoulder for 10 plus years. But Gilmour and Mason, they begged to differ, and they had no intention of abolishing Pink Floyd. Now, as we continue this story, I want to mention that today's episode is brought to you by Campfire Audio, the makers of Supermoon, the solid body, custom in-ear monitor that I listen to music with every single day. These are amazing. I was so blown away by my experience with Campfire Audio. Bought my first pair last summer, so I reached out to them and asked them to be our sponsor. Campfire Audio is the end-all be-all for music listening. Supermoon is truly a work of artistic engineering and design. With a refined aesthetic and stainless steel faceplate, a planar magnetic drive that ensures a low fatigue factor for us music junkies that listen to music for long periods of time. Supermoon is custom fit to the exact dimension of your ears. Campfire Audio offers Supermoon in 2 fit styles to choose from, the audiophile fit or the artist fit. And one of the best parts about purchasing Supermoon is that you'll be given personalized attention. Your Supermoon custom in-ear monitor will be individually designed and assembled by human hands at Campfire's headquarters. I gotta tell you, what I love most about Supermoon is the listening experience. It's so transformational. The songs I've heard 1,000 times sound like it's the first time that I've ever heard them. With Supermoon, you feel like you're right in the middle of the band, playing live. It's like discovering your favorite artist all over again. And you can't put a price on that. Click on the link in the description below to find out more about Supermoon and shop for other world-class earphones and components from Campfire Audio. You'll rediscover your favorite music with Supermoon, no question. So back to Pink Floyd. From Gilmour and Mason's perspective, it wasn't Waters' decision to make to dissolve Pink Floyd. After all, he was the one leaving the band. For Waters, not only was this irritating, but it also posed an obstacle for his solo career. As long as some version of Pink Floyd existed, he would always be in its shadow. The record company and buying public would always prize Pink Floyd's work over his own. It's just true. But what Waters really needed was for the formal dissolution of Pink Floyd. And that would pave the way, for his solo career. He probably assumed that this would naturally happen when he quit the band. Never for a moment did he believe that Pink Floyd could survive without him. But David Gilmour, he stood up for himself. He argued that at the age of 44 and after 20 years in this band, he was too old to start all over again. And he didn't see any reason why he should. But the bitter feud was just getting going. When Roger heard about David's plans to collaborate with Nick Mason for a new Pink Floyd album, Roger told him he'll never do it. And in 1986, he also announced to the world Pink Floyd was finished. These two incidents would only fuel the fire in David Gilmour and ultimately Waters' disdain. While making the next album, called A Momentary Lapse of Reason, David decided to experiment with several collaborators. Along the way, he spent time with Roxy Music guitarist Phil Manzanera, at 10cc's Eric Stewart, there was Liverpool poet Roger McGuff, Canadian musician Carol Pope, lyricist Anthony Moore, and then singer-songwriter John Caron. Also critical was the return of producer Bob Ezrin, who had worked on both The Wall and also Gilmour's solo album About Face. And get this, another surprising addition was the exiled Rick Wright. He returned after his wife begged David Gilmour to take him back. However, since Wright was legally prevented from rejoining the band, he would not be brought on as an official member. Instead, he was paid as a salaried employee. As the team of musicians around the two official members of Pink Floyd grew, the music really began to take shape. And in true Pink Floyd fashion, Gilmour wanted to create a thematic album. Though this would prove to be a challenge without Roger Waters' conceptual contributions. After several starts and stops, Gilmour's plan to produce a new thematic work stalled, and the idea was ultimately scrapped. And then the title of the record, that would also go through multiple iterations. A succession of names, there were Signs of Life, of Promises Broken, and Delusion of Maturity. They were all considered. The problem was that they feared Roger Waters, that he might use the title to criticize him. So it took them 3 weeks of just going back and forth before they concluded that there was no word or phrase in existence that Roger couldn't make fun of. So they settled on A Momentary Lapse of Reason, a phrase taken from the song One Slip. One that feels kind of like a jab at Waters for leaving the band, really. A Momentary Lapse of Reason, that was released on September 7th of 1987 in the UK, and then the day after in the US. It's comprised of 11 tracks, all of them composed by David Gilmour, either individually or in collaboration. Still, the record, it reached number 3 in both the UK and the US. Pretty good comeback there. In West Germany, the Netherlands, and Norway, it peaked at number 2, and in New Zealand, it went all the way to number 1. Singles included One Slip, On the Turning Away, oh, such a great song.
On the Turning Away.
And today's featured song, Learning to Fly. In fact, the last couple of days, I listened to the entire album a couple of times with my trusty Supermoons, and so great, breathtaking album. Learning to Fly, that came into being during the course of a jam session involving David Gilmour and John Caron. Caron came up with a chord progression that ended up on the track, so Gilmour generously, included him in the credits. Which is pretty cool and really in stark contrast to Roger Waters' approach. As a session player, Caron didn't expect this since it's generally considered a work-for-hire role. He said it just shows you what kind of a guy David Gilmour is. The lyrics were largely written by Anthony Moore and Gilmour, so overall the songwriting credits would be divided between David Gilmour, John Caron, Anthony Moore, and producer Bob Ezrin. In the literal sense, Learning to Fly is about David Gilmour's passion for flying, a hobby that he also shared with Nick Mason, still does. These flying lessons were a way of overcoming fear, since Gilmour and Mason were terrified of flying. But ultimately, they overcame their fear and even had a plane. They bought one together. I'm sure they still have it. Said Mason, "We ended up sharing planes for a number of years and frightening ourselves far more than we ever did on all those commercial flights." In fact, during the recording sessions, Gilmour was often absent from the studio because he was out clocking in flying hours. Said David Gilmour, "It was inspired by the fact that several mornings Anthony would be there hard at work and I wouldn't show up. I'd call up and tell someone that I was having a flying lesson, and they'd say, 'Dave's not coming in today because he's learning to fly.'" The lyrics directly and poetically describe, the experience of piloting a plane. There's no sensation to compare with this. Suspended animation, a state of bliss. Just listening to this song, it makes you feel like you can fly, like you're flying. In fact, if you're interested in learning how to, Gilmour added a recording of Nick Mason running through a pre-takeoff checklist just over 2 minutes in. Very cool. However, the song can be interpreted on a whole nother level. Not only is Gilmour conveying what he and Mason have been doing as a hobby, but to me, the song can also be seen as an expression of what they were doing with the band, moving forward into the horizon with faith, Learning to Fly symbolized a new departure for the band and for Gilmour, who was really now the sole captain of Pink Floyd. Gilmour himself said, Learning to Fly, from the spiritual aspect of it, is about Pink Floyd taking to their wings again, as well as me taking to my wings again. There's a sense of emancipation, like they're jettisoning the baggage and setting course for an entirely new direction. It's right in the lines. No navigator to guide my way home, unladen, empty, and turned to stone.
Unladen, empty, and turned to stone.
That could refer to Roger Waters, the navigator who is now gone. Also noteworthy is Gilmour's return to lead vocal duties, which, aside from one track on the final cut, it was his first time since The Wall. There are several exceptional Gilmour solos. Notably after the first chorus in the middle section and also in the coda. All the songs on the album, Nick Mason said, Learning to Fly was the most faithful to the sound and the spirit of Pink Floyd. In his word, he said, it feels very much like a home track. And it's hard to argue with that. Despite the very new direction for Pink Floyd, Learning to Fly, it just feels so familiar, yet brand new. Now, the music video for Learning to Fly, that was directed by Pink Floyd's graphic artist Storm Thorgerson. It was shot not far from Calgary, Alberta, during band rehearsals in the run-up to the tour. The video shows a young Native American man cutting wheat in an open field when he spots an airplane and some kind of shaman figure. Inspired by the thought of taking flight, he puts feathers in his armband, jumps from a cliff, and he turns into an eagle.
Across the clouds, I see my shadow fly.
The video did very well on MTV. It reached number 9 on MTV's Video Countdown, and it earned Pink Floyd a Video Music Award for Best Concept Video in 1988. Learning to Fly was the first single that was released from A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Although it only reached number 70 on the US Billboard chart, it did make it to number 1 on the mainstream rock chart. Internationally, it didn't chart in the UK, but it did go to number 60 in France, number 34 in Australia, and it went to 10 in New Zealand. Now, Learning to Fly hasn't done much in the way of media placements. It hasn't been covered a whole lot either. One unexpected cover version, though, came by the way of William Shatner and Tangerine Dream's guitarist Edgar Froese.
Into the distance, a ribbon of black.
This was part of his Ode to Space album, Seeking Major Tom, which included covers of several other notable flight and space-themed songs.
Tongue-tied and twisted, just an earthbound...
And although the Pink Floyd version of Learning to Fly hasn't been covered much, there are a few other bands who have broached the same topic. Emerson, Lake and Powell. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Both wrote songs called Learning to Fly. And the variation Learn to Fly has been used by the Foo Fighters. And more recently with Elton John in collaboration with Surfaces.
If you lift him up, you might just touch the sky.
So in conclusion, what did Roger Waters think of A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Learning to Fly? Well, his reaction was predictably negative. Remember how Gilmour and company were concerned about the album's title, fearing that Waters would use it against him no matter what? Let's just say that he rose to the occasion. He said, and I quote, "Under the circumstances, it's a superb title for a so-called Pink Floyd record." Waters also called the record being a clever forgery and said the songs were poor and Gilmour's lyrics were third-rate. So, he didn't hold back there. Here's the deal. I love the brilliance of Roger Waters' music, and it made Pink Floyd one of the greatest bands in history. I'd even go as far as saying he's a genius. He was the driving force behind some of the most monumental albums that have ever been released. And if the band could have put their differences behind them, you could argue that A Momentary Lapse of Reason could have soared to even greater heights. But that's a big if. Having said all of that, I love this album. It's better than anything that Waters has done solo. Again, that's how I feel. Having said that, I think Waters' possible contributions after the final cut to future Pink Floyd projects, they're just a sad mystery to all of us. I think it's something that any real lover of this band's music, we've all thought very deeply about it. I think in a perfect world, if the sides could have created music in peace, it would have made everything better. But that's not to say A Momentary Lapse of Reason was average Pink Floyd, by any means. I love it. It's one of my favorite records of the late 80s. Just for On the Turning Away and Learning to Fly alone. Two masterpieces, in my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Of course, the absence of Waters wouldn't stop Gilmour, Mason, and Wright from moving forward at all. Their decision to continue was undeniably successful, including from a commercial perspective. Their two studio recordings, A Momentary Lapse of Reason and The Division Bell, and their live set, Delicate Sound of Thunder, it outsold Roger Waters' solo material by a wide margin. And like I said, to my ears, more memorable. However, following a burst of activity in the mid-90s, Gilmour, Wright, and Mason put Pink Floyd on hold once again, although a series of reissues kept the band in the public eye. Then for a brief but shining moment in July of 2005, the classic lineup of Waters, Gilmour, Wright, and Mason, they put their differences aside and they performed together for the first time in over 20 years at the London Live 8 concert. Amazing. In the years that followed, there would be other reunions, as well as the passing of Syd Barrett in 2006, and then, sadly, Rick Wright, 2008. Two legends. Pink Floyd also released The Endless River in 2014, which Gilmour said would be their final album. He said, "I think we have successfully commandeered the best of what there is. It's a shame, but that is the end." There was no supporting tour for that album. Gilmour felt that it was impossible to go on without Wright. In 2015, Gilmour reiterated that Pink Floyd, they were essentially done. And to reunite without Wright would be just wrong. Now, since then, according to Nick Mason, David Gilmour, and Roger Waters, they remain at loggerheads over various issues. And sadly, at this point, reconciliation seems like a grim prospect at best. But there's always hope. Just when you think it's impossible, someone in the camp drops a breadcrumb. Recently, Pink Floyd reunited for the protest song, Hey, Hey, Rise Up. And then David Gilmour said it was possible that they could tour again. Then Nick Mason, he also said he was ready for a reunion like the one at Live 8. Who knows? One or all of them could have a momentary lapse of reason and decide to do it. Sorry, I had to go there. Leave us a comment about Pink Floyd and Learning to Fly. What are your memories of this song? What are your thoughts on Pink Floyd? The final cut, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, Waters' solo stuff. What's your favorite iteration of the band after they broke up? Let us know in the comments. Let's have a great discussion. And listen to it. Seriously, go check these out. These are amazing. Supermoon, Campfire Audio, incredible company. And also, if you like our content, please subscribe below. We'd love to have you. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.